So today I want us to explore a few sound design techniques that are also available on the lovely Byte oscillator, and of course you can just use Byte for these techniques, but it's always interesting to see how things work and also then take these techniques to various platforms. Now these techniques are very beginner friendly, by the way, so if you are just starting out with the grid or with synthesis, this might be useful for you. As always, I added also these techniques from this video to the PDF of tips and tricks I keep on updating. It's available on my Patreon together with the project files from this video and from many other videos. So the first technique is simple but effective. As you can see, the Byte module has two oscillators, A and B, right? So we can mix in A, and then we can mix in the second oscillator as another layer. Right, already the first thing we can do is detune the second oscillator, so it's a bit more complex. We can do this, of course, by octaves or by semitones or just a tiny bit. Right, I'm going to take this, let's say, 5 semitones down. Right, we can also wave shape, again, just to add more complexity. Right, so again, this is something we can expand on by building this simple setup ourselves. So here, for example, I have a sine wave. Right, already here we can shape also the sine wave, unlike on the Byte oscillator. Right, again, to add more complexity. Then I can mix in the second oscillator. Again, also here we have wave shaping. Also here we can detune things. Right, and here we can even, because we are using the mixer, we can even add panning, again adding more complexity to this simple idea of just mixing waveforms. So again, this is a simple technique, mixing waves, adding complexity, but again it's quite useful. I have here an example. Here I'm doing exactly this and also adding modulation. Right, I have here again a sine wave and a triangle. You can see modulation for the shape. I have here skew for the sine, skew for the triangle, and also some folding. Right, again, mixing things, and also here I'm adding panning modulation to one of the voices. Let me play this. Right, so again, it's a simple technique. All you have to do is just mix 2 oscillators, detune them a bit, and then when adding modulation, things can get pretty complex and pretty interesting. I have here a kick and a hi-hat, and then a bass also. Let me play this already, a bass, and also here I use the same technique, again in this case pulse and saw wave, detuned with some modulation. Right, so again adding complexity just by simply mixing waveforms. The next technique is similar to the first one, but in this case we combine the waves through ring modulation. Now ring modulation is a type of amplitude modulation, so oscillator B in this case will modulate the amplitude of oscillator A. Right here we have a dedicated ring modulation level. Right, also here we can detune the second oscillator and create more complex sounds. Right, also by lowering the frequency down, all the way down, you can really hear that this is amplitude modulation. It's modulating the amplitude of the sine wave. Right, and again, also this we can recreate. In this case, we have 2 options. We can use the multiply module and multiply the sine and the triangle. Right, again, creating ring modulation. Right, and again, if I take the frequency here all the way down, right, you can really hear that this is nothing but amplitude modulation, right, or a type of amplitude modulation. And we can also use a dedicated module AM, RM, again, amplitude modulation or ring modulation. In this case, all the way to the left, we have no effect. we get just a sine wave. Then somewhere in the middle, we have amplitude modulation. And all the way to the right, we have ring modulation. Right, so here I have an example with a multiply module, again, a sine wave and a triangle wave. You can see in a second, you will see this also. I have some modulation going. Let me play this. Right, again, a bit detuned. And this creates a nice, interesting, complex texture and sound. We can also, again, do this with the AM/RM module. In this case, I have the wavetable oscillator with the phase 1. And I'm also modulating here the modulation, so it will sometimes be without modulation, sometimes normal amplitude modulation, sometimes ring modulation. Let me unmute this. Again, I have here a kick and a hi-hat. And I also created here a bass. Maybe I will solo this for a second. I want to show you this. I have here a pulse and a saw wave that I'm mixing or combining with a multiply module. But what I'm also doing here, I have noise. And I'm using the AM/RM after this, so I'm basically doing ring modulation twice. Right, again, you can hear this texture, this noisy texture in the sound. So now we have something a bit more complex, but also quite effective, the XFM. Now in this case, the X stands for exponential, and FM is frequency modulation. So exponential frequency modulation, which is exactly like pitch modulation. In the case of byte, oscillator A will modulate oscillator B, so we will listen to oscillator B. Now I can add FM and create all sorts of weird sounds, detune things. Right, but we can also sync oscillator B to oscillator A and then get more stable results pitch-wise. Right, so if I turn on sync, now we get more timbre control, also with detuning. Right, again, without, with. Right, so again, we can recreate this with individual modules. Here we have again two oscillators. In this case, oscillator B is the triangle, and this is the oscillator we will listen to. And as I mentioned before, exponential FM or exponential frequency modulation is basically just like modulating the pitch, like vibrato, for example. So we will use the pitch input. Right, and now we can start adding FM. And you can see that if I bring the frequency of oscillator 1 down, we get basically, right, we get basically vibrato. And again, we can also sync oscillator B to oscillator 1 to get more stable results. All we have to do is use the retrigger input, so the oscillator will retrigger, will reset according to the frequency or to the phase of the first oscillator. And now listen to this. Again, without and with. And again, now if we detune the oscillator, we get more timbre control rather than pitch changes. Here I have a bass that I created again with FM. Right, also here I'm using the sync, right, I'm using the pitch input, and I have here also an envelope. You can see here pitch B. This will control the pitch of oscillator B, in this case again the triangle, and this will add timbre control instead of pitch control. Let me play this. Right, so this is without FM. Also nice, but then we can add complexity with FM. Now again, here I'm syncing the oscillator, but also without sync, FM can be quite useful for creating all sorts of percussive sounds. Here I'm using 2 pulse waves or 2 pulse oscillators, again FMing the second one, but in this case without sync, so the result is more noisy and metallic. Right, perfect for sorts of hi-hats. I have here also an ARP, again that I created with FM. Maybe I will solo this one for a second. Right, in this case I have cascading modulation, so I have one oscillator modulating another oscillator that is modulating a third oscillator. Right, again creating all sorts of interesting timbres and textures. Right, this just needs a nice kick drum. The last technique I want to show you is audio rate pulse width modulation. In the case of byte, oscillator B will modulate the pulse width of oscillator A, so we listen again to oscillator A, and of course this will be also at audio rate, so with a higher frequency, and we can detune things. Right, the shape of modulation will also change the result, and this doesn't have to be just for a square wave. This can be for any shape that has some sort of skew or shape control, right? Now again, to recreate this, for this we will need the modulator out module, this one here. Right, I have a triangle, and then we have a skew control, and the sine will modulate the skew control, again going through the modulator out. Right, modulating this at audio rates. Again, the tuning is important here. Right, and listen to this interesting sound. Right, so here I have an example. I have here a sine, right, modulating the pulse width of a pulse wave, again with the modulator out module. Let me play this. Again, a bit detuned here, modulating the fold of the sine wave. So we get an interesting texture, an interesting sound. I also have here a bass. Right, in this case I'm using 2 sine waves. Again, the sine has also skew control, which is a sort of shape control or pulse width control, if you will. Right, and again I'm using a sine, another sine with the modulator out to modulate the pulse width. Let me solo this maybe. Right, so if I take this down, it will sound like this. Right? Then with the modulation we have a bit more texture, there's an envelope opening the filter here. Right, I have here also a drone, and in this case I'm using 3 techniques that we looked at already. I'm using FM with sync. Right, I'm using a pulse wave to FM the sine oscillator here. Right, and then I'm using pulse width modulation. This is in turn modulating the pulse width, and I'm also using ring modulation or the multiply module. So we have ring modulation, audio rate pulse width modulation, FM, and sync. This is the drone, I will solo it. Right, you can hear really interesting texture. Right, so again, these techniques are quite simple but very effective. You can experiment with them in all sorts of ways. Consider joining us on Patreon and Discord. Thank you for watching. Cheers.